Hello everybody and welcome to Climate Change Unit 3. You might be noticing that our setting is a little bit different than you're used to. Due to the new COVID restrictions, we are no longer filming these in the lab and instead are filming them from my home. Over the first units of this course, we learned a lot about the physical basis of climate change. And now we're going to look forward into how it impacts living things, including humans, and what we can do about it. Come on along, let's learn. Our quote for today comes from Leonardo DiCaprio, a United Nations messenger of peace, who says, "Climate change is real. It is happening right now. It is the most urgent threat facing our entire species, and we need to work collectively together and stop procrastinating." By the end of today, you will be able to explain the impacts of climate change on biological systems. The topic of today's class is big enough that we could run an entire course on just today. Unfortunately, due to the fact that you have to understand the physical basis of climate change before we can look at this, we're not able to dedicate that much time to it, and so this is going to be a little bit more of a survey than you're used to in our other sections. So let's get into it. Let's start off with some background in biology of things that you need to know that'll help you understand why climate change will be a challenge for some organisms. And the first thing is organisms evolved to fit in the environment in which they evolved. So, if you change the environment, an organism needs to respond. There are several different ways that organisms can respond, one of which is range shifting. And this is where the organism physically relocates to a new geographic area. This can be assisted by humans if we want to help species survive. Another is adaptation, which is an evolutionary process and requires generations to pass. And therefore, organisms with longer generation times have a harder time adapting. And then finally, there's extinction. If the organism cannot fit into the new environment or move to a location where they are exposed to their old environment, they will die out. Some taxa or groups of organisms are more susceptible to change than others. Specialist species are at greater risk than generalists, and long-lived species, or species with a longer generation time, are more at risk than those that are short-lived. There will be winners and losers of climate change. Generalist species will move in to fill the niches vacated by specialists, and therefore you would expect their populations to surge, while specialist populations will shrink. We're going to look at a series of different case studies, and the first one that I want to look at with you are coral reefs, and this is because you're already familiar with the impact. Right? Warming oceans cause thermal stress. That leads corals to bleach or expel their photosynthetic algae, the zooxanthellae, that give the corals their brilliant colors, as well as provide them foods. Increased thermal stress also suppresses immune systems and leaves corals more susceptible to diseases. Hurricanes break down reef structure, and if hurricanes are infrequent or not as strong, reefs are able to recover. But the stronger the hurricane, or the more frequently that strong hurricane goes through, the greater the likelihood that the coral reef will be unable to recover from the damage that it experiences. There are many different changes that will affect coral reefs. If we affect the coral, then that has an impact on the fish that live there as well. A lot of us are really interested in the effects on vertebrates, probably because we identify with them the most. So in North America alone, there are many examples of mammals that are threatened with extinction because of climate change. And you've heard of the Arctic mammals like polar bears or wolverines, pika and snowshoe hare that will experience reduced habitat because of climate change. But there's other examples that you might not have thought of as well. One of those is the Indiana bat. The Indiana bat requires a very narrow range of temperature to breed and hibernate. With climate change, that narrow band of temperature will be farther north. However, the Indiana bat lives in caves, and there are fewer cave systems in the north. Why should we care? Well, the Indiana bat eats mosquitoes. And we can expect disease-carrying mosquitoes to become more common in climate change scenarios. The Indiana bat is also threatened because of white nose syndrome, which is the fungal disease of the respiratory system. And if you have that as well as climate change in the mix, you have a lot of stressors on that population. If we want to look at options for managing our mammal populations in a way that doesn't require solving the entire climate change problem, most of those options involve with improving landscape connectivity, allowing for that range shifting, reducing stresses on current populations so that way the animals can put more energy into adapting to their new environment. We have to maintain habitat and make sure the landscape remains diverse. Still in the vertebrates, let's take a look at some examples from amphibians. A third of amphibians are at risk of extinction today. And there are a bunch of different reasons for that. Many amphibians rely on ephemeral or vernal pools of water, which are pools that show up in the spring with heavy rains and then dry up in the summer, in order to breed. Well, under climate change scenarios, ephemeral or vernal pools will dry up earlier in some locations. If they dry up before tadpoles metamorphose into adults, then reproduction will fail. Another example is a disease called chytridiomycosis, also known as chytrid, which is a fungus that grows on amphibian skins. And when it grows on the frog's skin, it interferes with the frog's ability to exchange gases and water through that skin, which is essential for frog survival. Chytrid likes warmer conditions, so the range of this disease is likely to spread with climate change. In addition to the likelihood of an infection being greater under warmer conditions, with warmer conditions, infections that do occur are more likely to be fatal. In reptiles, reproduction is often tied to specific temperatures and moisture levels. Warm spells in winter can interrupt hibernation. Saltwater intrusion can cause loss of habitat. And I think one of the most interesting examples of an impact of climate change on an organism is the effect of temperature on sex determination. In crocodilians and turtles, the sex of the offspring is not determined chromosomally, but it's determined by temperature at which the eggs incubate. If the temperature is warm, females result, and if the temperature is cold, you get males. Since these nests are not incubated by the parents, but instead their temperature is determined by ambient conditions, an increase in temperature will yield an imbalance in sex ratio, which may harm evolutionary fitness. The warmer it gets, the more females are born. And we're lucky it's not the other way around, because one male can fertilize many females, but at a certain point, you do need males in a population. If we go ahead and take a look at the sex ratio of hatchling sea turtles around the world, we can see that an imbalance already exists. So in the pie chart, we can see different colors being the different species of sea turtles. So you've got green sea turtles and hawksbills, flatbacks, loggerheads, leatherbacks, and olive ridleys. And the percent of the pie that's filled with color is the percent of hatchlings that are currently female. So we can look in almost everywhere on Earth, the majority, in some cases the vast majority, of individuals being born today are females. Very few male sea turtles are being born. So that's it for our vertebrates. And let's take a look at the relationship between plants and pollinators. For pollination to be successful, the flowers and pollinators must be present at the same time. Some evidence, and I'm going to say some evidence because this is not as rigorous as the other things we've discussed in this class, suggests that as spring moves earlier in the year, the emergence of flowers and pollinators may move out of sync. So as we look at this graph here, we're looking at one example of one species in one forest in Japan. We can see that the earlier in the year that flowers bloom, so 100 days into the year, or 110 days into the year, or 120 days into a year, the earlier flowers bloom, the more days off the flowers are from the insect pollinators. So if flowers start to bloom earlier and earlier, there may be fewer and fewer pollinators available to result in successful seed production. We touched briefly on mosquitoes a little bit ago. We mentioned that mosquitoes are a vector for diseases, and these diseases include things like malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, Zika, and others. And climate change may increase the range of mosquito species that carry diseases, such as Aedes aegypti. Like much of what we have learned of climate change, mosquito-borne illness is not caused by it, but it could be made worse. Other factors are important. A lot of the problems associated with mosquito-borne diseases can be solved by managing standing water. If we go ahead and take a look at the map of Ecuador, we can see locations where Aedes aegypti mosquitoes are present. We can see that in the middle of the country of Ecuador lies some high elevation areas. So these are the Andes Mountains. And I've put a blue circle over Quito, the capital of Ecuador, which is high up in the mountains above where you would expect to find these mosquitoes. So as temperatures warm and those mosquitoes are able to range shift into the mountains, you would expect the likelihood of a disease outbreak of a mosquito-borne disease in Quito to become more likely. There are many diseases that are caused by viruses and bacteria that used to infect people and livestock but don't anymore. A couple examples of these are things like smallpox and anthrax. If these live trapped in ice or permafrost and that ice melts, well, maybe these would come back. Many news stories have suggested this. Are there zombie viruses like the 1918 flu thawing in the permafrost? I do want to tell you that this might not be your biggest source of worry when related to climate change. The likelihood that those viruses or bacteria are alive in the ice is low, and very few people actually live in the areas where that ice is melting. Most studies suggest that if there is going to be another big disease outbreak in the near future, it is highly unlikely that this is where it comes from. So I've put up here a title of a paper, Vertebrates on the Brink as Indicators of Biological Annihilation in the Sixth Mass Extinction. About 543 vertebrate species went extinct in the 20th century. There are currently 515 vertebrates with fewer than 1,000 individuals living. Once you lose a species, that loss is irreversible. This is not just a climate problem. This is habitat loss, and poaching, and pollution, and many other contributing factors, but climate change is a big one. The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, is an excellent book that's easy to read if you would like to have a good example of, or a good discussion of human-caused extinction. I would highly recommend it. So let's take a throwback to Unit 2. You can see the changes on the edge. Our climactic zones are shifting, and so with it, you can expect to see shifts in populations. Looking across the lake into Wisconsin, we can see that many plants are not able to keep up with the changing climate. If we take the geographical area where a species can be found and find the center of its abundance, and we put a dot there, and we remeasure that over time, we can see that the center of mass of each species is migrating. And if we take a look at where our temperatures are moving, we can see that our temperatures are moving north faster than our species are able to travel. You know that droughts are more likely to occur under climate change scenarios. Some infestations, such as the pine beetle, happen more under drought conditions. Climate change, therefore, is expected to cause an increase in infestations of pine beetles. In the California drought from 2011 to 2016, western pine beetles led to the mortality of 129 million trees. Prolonged droughts are expected to become more common as the climate continues to warm, increasing the stress on lower elevation tree species and increasing the likelihood of pine beetle infestations in the future. Plants also face the problem of fire. Over time, the amount of land that is being burned in the United States by fire has been increasing. This has forced the federal government to increase spending on fire suppression. As time goes on, this gets worse for plants and worse for the budget. The US produces a quarter of the world's grain supply. If we increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, that may result in increased yields. However, plants grown under higher CO2 concentrations have lower nutrient values. Extreme temperatures, a reduction of chilling hours for some crops like apples, and rain and drought events are able to impact the success of a year's crop. If you think about the Michigan cherry crop of 2012, it failed because the buds opened early in the spring when we had a warm stretch, and then a frost came and killed them all. On top of that, many pests and weeds and fungi thrive in warmer temperatures. If we look at this graph of bushels of corn produced per acre over time, we can see that we've had a pretty steady increase in our yields. However, climatic events result in huge decreases in success. As droughts or floods, as wet springs or diseases become more common and larger in impact, you can expect to see these effects become more and more significant. Heat waves directly threaten livestock. Long-term heat stress increases disease susceptibility, reduces fertility, and milk production. Warmer temperatures and shorter winters also increase the prevalence of parasites. Drought also threatens feed supplies. If feed becomes less nutritious, more must be fed. Many of the cows in the United States are not raised in pastures, but instead in wild rangelands, which means that they're not eating cultivated crops, but they're eating what's just growing in the wild. If you have changes in drought or temperature or other climatic conditions, the plants that are available for those cows will change. In huge sections of rangeland in Arizona and New Mexico, the carrying capacity of cows on the land has decreased. Let's circle back around and kind of finish where we started, looking in the ocean. There will be range shifting of marine species just like there was for terrestrial ones. This range shifting will change competition within an ecosystem, and as well as be difficult for industry that has established geographical locations for fishing the different species. We also know that disease outbreaks have resulted from increasing temperature and salinity in estuaries. Estuaries are places where rivers meet the sea and where many fish start their lives. Changing seasons and temperatures can affect the timing of reproduction and migration. And then, of course, we have the ocean acidification thing again. I know we covered a lot today, but I think it's important for us to get a big picture look at how biological systems are likely to be affected by climate change. Think about how those things can impact human society, and we'll talk about that when we get to class. Bye-bye, everyone.